Hello, everyone. If you're finding us, saying that we're live on Facebook, hopefully we'll be live on Instagram soon. So if you're joining us on either Facebook or Instagram, welcome. We'll be getting started here in a minute as we wait for some folks and friends to find us. And I'm going to bounce this over to my main page. Hi, everybody joining us on Facebook and Instagram. You are here for the Trauma and the 12 Steps release live cast. So very, very happy to have you with us. And we're just giving a minute for people to find us here and we'll get started. Oh, these watch parties. People get into trouble with those watch parties. Like at our reading.
Oh, yes. They start their own damn meeting. It's so funny. They didn't know it, or they're combing their hair.
So welcome. If you're on Instagram or Facebook, stand by. We're just giving a minute for people to find us here and to get things shared on all of the pages. We're running a couple different live casts here at the same time, knowing that most people will watch this on the recording. So in any event, welcome. Welcome, Daryl.
Well, welcome, Jamie.
So it is July 7th, 2020. This is the release date of the reboot edition of Trauma and the 12 Steps. So when North Atlantic Books, my publisher, said it was coming out today, I got extremely excited because July 6th is my belly button birthday and July 8th is my sobriety anniversary. So tomorrow, if I keep doing what I'm doing the rest of the night tonight, I will have 18 years of continuous recovery from drugs and alcohol. And yeah, I had no choosing of July 7th being the release date. And 7 is, of course, one of my favorite numbers too. So it was just really very cool that they picked today, North Atlantic Books picked today for the release date of Trauma and the 12 Steps. And I wanted to do a live cast tonight on my pages. I've been interviewed by a lot of other people for this book, which I love and I enjoy answering questions, but I wanted to have a live cast available on our social media pages, which I often do when I release a book. But I don't like just kind of talking to the camera. It's really not my favorite thing to do unless I know I'm talking with somebody or I'm interacting with somebody on the other side. So I thought, who did I want to interview me tonight on our pages about the Trauma and the 12 Steps work and the reboot? And so I invited my 12-step sponsor, Daryl C. or Shintan, to join me tonight for this interview, which I think is going to turn more into a conversation about kind of where 12-step recovery has been, where it's going, and what it means to be more trauma informed. And one of the core audiences of the book are sponsors, because yes, it's written largely with professional audience in mind, but to me, sponsors, even people who don't have any professional training, could stand to learn a thing or two about trauma. People who are in leadership positions in 12-step contexts can stand to learn a thing or two about trauma. So even though my sponsor here had a long, stellar career as a professional, you know, he's sponsored a lot of people over the years, and he was not my sponsor when the first edition came out in 2012. Misty wants to be heard on the live cast too, apparently this evening, which is always a very fun thing. So Daryl, Bubba, or as I call you, or Misty. Misty, are you going to interview Mommy? I'd like to welcome you to the live cast.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to welcome you. You know, this is in a way, this is your debut. Mm-hmm. You know, this is it. You know, you're well written. I know that this is not your first book. This is certainly not, but I know from talking to you and from the past year, talking about what was going on with the book, mm-hmm. and with you in the book, all right, mm-hmm. that this book really does mean a lot to you.
Yes.
Is there a specific reason why this book seems to hold so much for you? I know you're very proud of everything that you've written, but this book is just something special to you. And I can tell, you can see it right now in your face.
Yes. I mean, so the first edition came out in 2012, and it was so special to me that I decided to kind of quote unquote self-publish it in order for it to be done correctly. Because I had this idea that there is a way we can still be pro 12 step while also being pro trauma. Because I was somebody who came up with a very trauma focused, trauma informed sponsor who, I ended up not hating the 12 steps as a result of her. And there's a lot of 12-step criticism. Some of it I think is unfair, but a lot of it I think is legitimate. That's out there, especially in the trauma mental health circles. And when I would hear a lot of people in the mental health side of our profession kind of down the 12 steps, one of my responses was, well, you didn't have my sponsor. You didn't have Janet, the woman who brought me recovery, right. Because she was not only the first to validate what was going on with my addiction and recovery and knowing the help I needed, but she was the first who named some of the reactions I was having as post-traumatic. And so I experienced the 12 steps for the fullest of what they could be in my first year or two sober. And then even after those initial 2 years, when I came back to the US and I started doing my graduate work in counseling, she was very clear to me, like, you're going to continue to need to do some other work, whether that be in an Al-Anon fellowship, whether it be getting your own trauma counseling that's more sophisticated than what she was able to offer me. And I did. And I think my recovery in my life has always been a testament to the possibilities that you can have innovation, but still kind of honor and respect the traditions of what 12-step can offer us. And yeah, it was cool because when I started teaching continuing ed courses like 2009, 2010, pretty heavily, that was a lot of feedback I got from audiences like, wow, you have a way of like not knocking the 12 steps while still calling out the problems. And it's not an all or nothing, it's a both and. And so I thought, well, if this is how I train, then surely this is going to be a great idea for a book. And the publisher I'd worked with at the time, they weren't so convinced because they're like, well, 12 steps, the kiss of death. And then another publisher I went to liked the idea for the book, but they wanted to make it more of an academic book. And it was my passion from the beginning that I wanted this to be something that was affordable to a typical recovery person, affordable to a sponsor. And so I believed so strongly in the core message of the book, I did what I needed to do in order to self-publish it. And I did. And a lot of publishers over the years looked at it and still was like, well, it's either a little too niche or you're too 12-step or too trauma. But the reality is, Daryl, one of the reasons this book means so much to me is I have made so many cool connections in my life because of that book. People who found it just on Amazon, found it through searching. One of my dear work partners and collaborators now, Steve, who I've gone on to write another book with, he found me through Trauma and the 12 Steps. So there's just been so many amazing connections that have come about from the book. And it really speaks so strongly to, I think, who I am as a person, to what I teach, to what I espouse in recovery. And the fact that North Atlantic Books said, yeah, we like it. We'll take it, especially because 8 years have passed since the original edition. And it really did feel like a good time for a reboot. I just jumped at the chance to be able to do another edition of this with the help and support of a publisher that's really committed to putting out this kind of material.
Very good. That's, I can feel your passion for this. All right. And, and I share it. I have to say that I share it. I come to this as a counselor for one thing. I counseled for 40 some years. And I can remember doing training. Some of the original training that I did talked about trauma, but only in the context of battlefield. Yeah. It was the Vietnam era. This is when I got my start. It was working with Vietnam veterans. And, this is this is trauma at probably its most intense, constant, what would you call that, presentation,
Right.
all right? And, you know, I always had a feeling that there's more to this than that. And then in 1985, I went to school. I went to school for 3 months at Rutgers and the School of Alcohol Studies. I did that, and I did some other work. And I had professors there and instructors that were in the new kind of new age adult children of alcoholics, inner child movement. Charlie Whitfield was one of my instructors.
Cool.
Janet Wojcicki was one of my instructors. You know, I had these kinds of people, and they were going into an idea about trauma being more than things that happen in the battlefield. You know, simply a chaotic family for many people ends up, they record it as trauma in their being. And this is when I got your first book in 2012, long before I met you. The first book, it impressed me because you talked about trauma as something that not just every day, but so many of the people that we deal with, you know, the people who come from an addictive background, particularly people who are into recovery, trying to get into recovery, they have these aspects of trauma that just begin to show through. And there was, I can't say there was no way to address them, right? But it wasn't addressable with strictly cognitive behavioral therapy. Let me put it that way. So I was left in a difficult position because I would address it differently with some of the stuff that I learned at Rutgers and I had to, you know, that was back when, you know, I was working in an outfit where you had to be supervised, and I had a psychologist who was my supervisor, and she would get in my butt all the time because I was using new kinds of approaches to trauma and using and looking at trauma in my clients. And she did not appreciate that. She one of the things and it was the easiest thing for her to do was to say, you're acting on outside your scope of training and knowledge. And I had been trained, right? But she was the boss, you know? So now this book, I really believe, opens that up even more than the 2012 edition. This opens that up because I think what I read in this book, in this book, I think what I read is a more deeply personal approach for people who are not, and particularly for people who are not professionals, who are simply sponsors of people. And you know, I hand it to you. You stuck to your guns, and this is what we end up with. I think a very good volume of recovery resources.
And thank you for noting about how the second edition has a little bit more of a deeply personal flavor, because people are asking me what are some of the differences between the first and the second edition. And honestly, when I wrote the first edition in 2012, it was my best stab at this work, like just getting it out there in the arena. And it was very hard to me, and this is why a lot of people were skeptical of what I was doing, to write like a multi-audienced book. Because and even I struggled with, and it was only my second book, and finding my voice, like, am I speaking to professionals? Am I still making it personal enough for the general recovery community to like? And because I wanted to reach sponsors as well. And it was interesting to me because when the first edition was done, I felt I had largely put together what was more or less a professional book, just with more of a friendly tone. which is what I try to do in my professional books anyway. But it was very inspiring to me to see how, quote unquote, ordinary people in recovery resonated with the book too, who were not necessarily professionals and were not even necessarily sponsors, but just read a first couple chapters and had this sense of, wow, you're speaking my language here. So, I mean, one of the things North Atlantic really allowed me to do here was to get more deeply personal, but really still making it clear that I know what the hell I'm talking about from a professional perspective, and using the citations to indicate that as appropriate. And the whole book is really about the necessity of bridge building instead of wall building. And I think there's a lot of bridges that have to be built here, because too many of the problems anywhere in society, especially even in recovery circles, are about this kind of us versus them mentality that we tend to have. Like the mental health people think they got the answer over the addiction people. And then even within the mental health field, like what you said with that psychologist, like, it's CBT versus the more body-centered types of therapies, and AA versus NA. And if you're going like specifically within 12-step, and we don't want people who are on medically assisted treatment to come here. We don't want drug addicts at our AA meeting. And one of the people I quote in this book is Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber, who's one of my favorite modern thinkers. She's a real progressive Lutheran pastor. And I heard her speak at a festival last year. And she said, I think as a people, as a society, our biggest drug of choice is thinking we're better than other people. And that really struck with me, very much struck a chord with me. And what if we actually talk about the things that are working and try to get to some consensus instead of thinking like our way is the only way? Another line I said in the first edition, and I say it here, is that I think the most dangerous words in any system is "this is the way we've always done it." And I think you can still honor tradition. I mean, as I still honor what Bill and Bob gave us in 1935, but to open it up to critique and review, and the recognition that we've learned a heck of a lot more about the brain since 1935. We've learned a heck of a lot more about trauma since 1935. And so, I mean, I've always prided myself on kind of being a person who builds bridges. It might have been a little maladaptive at first, because I came out of my home the hero child diplomat who always was trying to bridge the gap between fights and whatnot. But I think where I've been able to use that skill to my advantage as an adult and as a professional is let's have conversations here. Let's look at what's working. And for me, there are aspects of 12 steps that work and continue to work. And there are places where I clearly needed outside help in order to really heal the traumatic aspects. And one of the kind of practices I take to task, which is in no way endorsed in 12-step literature, is this practice that some meetings and some sponsors get into of telling people things like, you don't need to go to counseling. You don't need to take medication. All you need is to not drink and go to meetings. So you've been around a while. Tell me some of your feelings on that as it happens.
I think what we need to do is we need to begin to highlight the areas in, for instance, AA literature that speak very distinctly to the idea that there are other ways, that there are other approaches. Bill Wilson constantly was looking for ways to help people. He had this vision that someday he would be able to help people get into recovery and not have to go, not have this sense that I have to go to meetings 13 times a week.
Right.
He wanted people to be able to live a life, happy, joyous, and free. He was very much in favor of that. Very much. He lamented the idea that he said, what he said was, I regret the fact that I have been put in a position of never being able to not be on stage. I have not been able to be a member of AA. And he said, I really regret that.
Yeah.
And this speaks to it very deeply. The other part is this gives people the permission, right, to be in 12-step recovery and still have differences of opinion about what the 12 steps actually mean. There's certain parts of it that I find offensive personally, right?
Yeah.
I don't throw that out a lot,
Mm-hmm.
right? I don't think it's necessary to, because it's my opinion and it's to help me, right? But I certainly am able to, with people who I sponsor or mentor or whatever, I'm able to say, yes, you have a right to do that. You have a right to do that, right? Of course, many people do not like going to meetings. That doesn't mean that you're at this point in time in your recovery that you should stop going to meetings.
Right.
For one thing, one of the most wonderful parts of meetings is it's a good social support system. 12 steps or not, it's a good social support system. You're going to find people who are a little bit more like you than you're probably going to find out in the general public, and certainly more accepting of your own foibles. Right? You go out on the street and say, "Hi, everybody! I'm an addict. I'm an alcoholic." People are going to look at you. Oh yeah, sure. We really love that. Get out of here. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree overall, and I do still think that there is an innate magic in what Bill and Bob found, which is this power of one alcoholic helping another. And I do think that social support can be a big help. Yet the other side of that, which I call out in the book, is that meetings, especially group consciousness meetings that happen to help to define a group, really have to address a lot of problems that can happen in meetings, like predatory behavior. And I know we had to do that in our home group at one point.
Yes.
Because I want meetings to be a place that are as safe as possible for people to come, and where they don't have to worry about a lot of that bullshit that might have been part of their trauma or their use to even start with. And I mean, so many problem I've seen just so many times over the years, people taking touch to an inappropriate place, people, women especially, but it's not to say this doesn't happen with men, being picked up on and hit on, and I live for the day where meetings aren't that. But I also know that we're dealing with a lot of imperfect people coming together.
That's right. There's the human side. I can't agree more.
So for those of us who, do have some years behind us and are in more leadership positions, I do think it's up to us to hold meetings accountable. Because for those of you who aren't aware, each 12-step meeting is autonomous, that there's not, and that's could be both a blessing and a curse, is what I have found. And the other issue that I tackle in this book too is that there's a difference between meetings and treatment centers, but I think some of the same problems exist in both, because you can have some leadership structures in treatment centers that can get very dogmatic. A lot of treatment centers can be very unhealthy, and a lot of treatment centers, which ought to ideally have the tools to help people have the tools to help people address the trauma parts, often don't. So I think there's something for everybody in this. If you currently work a 12-step program and you're wanting to know either how you personally or how you in a leadership position can be able to be more trauma informed and fundamentally do better. So, yeah. Well, I talk about you in the book.
I know.
And obviously, Darrell's not in the first edition because I didn't know him in 2012. I met him probably around 2015 through finding a new home group. And part of the story that I tell in the book, which again is an update since 2012, is there was a period I went through where shortly, but not too long after the first Trauma 12 was released, that I was wondering what role 12-step recovery would really play in my life.
Your life.
Going forward. Because I had felt like I was burned out from a lot of local meetings. I found that I really wasn't getting what I needed at a lot of local meetings, but I was still praying the 12-step prayers and embracing a lot of 12-step concepts. I was doing, obviously, a lot of trauma work. But I wondered if I was going to go the way of a lot of those people who just say, the 12 steps work for me for a time, but I don't really need them anymore. I really wasn't getting what I needed out of sponsorship.
I already did that.
Yeah. And what ended up happening was I started going to LGBT meetings. And that really changed a lot for me. I am a bisexual individual, and I thought maybe there's something and I never been to a queer meeting, like 12 years into my recovery. And something said, maybe you need to check one of these out. And I remember the first one I went to was the 46th Street Clubhouse in New York City when I was traveling there. And it was amazing. And I got my 12-year coin in 2014 at that meeting. And I said, I need to check out the LGBT meeting locally. And I did. And that's when you were sick and weren't there. And it was like, okay, this is interesting. And then, but I still don't know if, again, AA has a place in my life. And then probably a month or so after that, my good friend Jason Fair, who's no longer with us, and he's one of the people I dedicated the book to, he had just gotten out of treatment, and he reached out to me and he said, I need rides. Can you take me on Saturday morning? And when I was home, I did that. And then by the time I went back to the Saturday morning meeting, you had come back.
Yeah.
And I said, how have I not met this man before? Like,
well, I hadn't gone to that meeting for years because before I got sick, I worked every Saturday morning.
Right.
That was a big thing.
And Jason's like, Daryl's a meditation teacher, and he's doing this other group on Thursday night that's mindfulness meditation in the 12 steps. And I said, this is somebody I really got to get to know. Mm-hmm. And I did. And not long after that, I remember going to Daryl's house and having the good old, this is my life type of dump. And I realized that we both practiced yoga in the same yoga lineage, which was another great coincidence. And I will tell you that first time I met with you properly, I felt like I did not have to hold anything back. And for a lot of years in my 12-step recovery, I had been working with a sponsor who was so good to me. And I owe so much to her in terms of a debt of gratitude. But I felt I was doing a lot of holding back because I should be farther along in my recovery by now, or I should know better. And I felt I was always trying to go into the default of, well, this is what a good 12-step person in recovery would say. And the thing I like to say about Daryl is, like, we could talk about anything. Right. Like nothing is off the table. And I just think people, especially who maybe have some years in recovery, we need to be able to create those spaces for each other. Because I do think the kiss of death for a lot of us is when we think, oh, we've got it, we're good. Either that can happen, or we can do what I did, which is, I should know better.
I ought to be better than this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a killer. I had good teachers
mm-hmm.
who basically moved me past that.
Good.
And it was, I'm able to say to people, no, you're where you're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
This is a growing program. We grow.
Mm-hmm.
We grow.
Yeah.
And it's. I've been very fortunate over the years. Even the yoga lineage that we belong to, mm-hmm. the teachers there, my main teacher there, always encouraged me to go to AA meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Go to AA, he told me. Go mm-hmm. to AA, mm-hmm. and it's that's I learned a lot from that.
Yeah,
I learned a lot from that, and from that I also got to view some trauma in action.
Right.
I got to see, there was a big hiccup in the program there that happened, and I got to see people who got traumatized mm-hmm. directly by something that I was a part of, mm-hmm. even though I wasn't part of the mm-hmm. part of causing the trauma.
Yeah.
And had to learn, how can I help? First of all, help them and myself to not be traumatized by this.
Right. Yeah. So it's been quite a journey. And I also noticed that since the 2012 book, something else I talk about in here is I've come out of retirement as a sponsor myself.
Yes.
I now, for so many years I had said I can't sponsor because I spend so much of my energy counseling and teaching others. And I didn't think I could really do justice to sponsoring. And, and I think it was early 2018, a woman who has quite a bit of years around here asked me if I would sponsor her because she was looking for something a little deeper in her sponsorship, and everything inside me said, say yes. Because you're always on this pedestal that we need more kind of good, solid sponsorship and sponsors who are willing to be more trauma informed and be supportive of practices like yoga and meditation, and be supportive of people who may not feel like they fit in places because of their sexuality. And I now sponsor 4 women, and they do more for me, I think, than I do for them. In terms, and it's really helped me connect with this notion of that this is what the 12th step is about, is just the power we get from sharing the message.
There is a healing in service, and the part of us that get that, the parts of us that benefit from that, can't tell the difference between how big it is.
Yeah. So here's a question I have for you, because it's an issue that I tackle in the book. It's an issue that comes up in a lot of my professional trainings. What is the line, especially with the 12th step, the 12th step, which is continue to carry the message, essentially what it's summarized, between being of service and falling into a codependency trap?
What's the line?
Yeah, of like, but people need me. And so I kind of neglect taking care of myself because people need me.
10th step.
Go on.
10th step, review. What am I getting out of this? What am I getting out of this? From time to time, what have I been doing? What am I getting out of it? How does it benefit me? Is it benefiting others in the way that I feel it ought to be benefiting them? I mean, ask these questions and answer them for myself honestly. Honestly. And when I find that I'm needing them more than they need me, all right, I have to step back and say, listen, all right, this is not where you should be getting your help. This is not where you should be getting your input, service input. This should be from someone else, some other area. Or perhaps you should go back and talk to one of your old counselors.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another kind of new thing in this edition of the book, as I said, I've talked about some of my own life and how it's changed in the last 8 years. I also interviewed Daryl's husband, Mike, for the book, because I do 2 new chapters in the book. One is on diversity as a trauma-informed issue, and how our recovery spaces, whether they be treatment centers or meetings, have to be more welcoming to, just to generalize it, to people who are different than us. And that could mean people that are different than us in terms of race, gender identity, ethnicity, sexual orientation. But it can also mean getting your head out of your ass, excuse me, because I feel very strongly about this, when it comes to things like, we don't want drug addicts at an AA meeting because it's going to bring in a certain kind of element. And there's just no place for that anymore, if there ever was a place for it. So that is something I really tackle in the diversity chapter too. And then I do a chapter on spiritual diversity, which is, for instance, recognizing things like spiritual abuse and how people who have had spiritual or religious trauma can struggle with the spiritual aspects of this program. And I also really create a call for us to create spaces that are more inclusive of people who are atheist, agnostic, non-believing in a deity. And Daryl's, so I have to be honest, I think I've told you this. I certainly said it in the book, that one of the reasons I chose Daryl to sponsor me, because I mean, if you know how some old school people think it's like women with women, men with men, but then when you put queer people into the mix, I mean, I don't think that really applies. Because the key is, are you finding a sponsor that's the best possible fit for you, or being romantically taken advantage of is not? And Daryl's like my dad at this point. And is just the best possible sponsor for me. And one of the reasons I was really drawn to Daryl and his husband, Mike, who was in the program, is because, I mean, these guys have been out for over 50 years in Ohio. And if sponsorship is defined as finding people who have what you want, I met them at a time in my life where I wanted that level of being able to live authentically. And that's why, I chose Daryl. And as I say in the book, even though Daryl's my sponsor, Mike has been just as important to me, not only because of seeing what they have together, but seeing how Mike, as somebody who identifies as an atheist, can still get this program and still benefit from it. And I interviewed him and asked him, like, how? Because especially in our part of the world, here in
The
Northeast
Bible Belt.
Ohio, where we're still technically Bible Belt as far as I'm concerned. And like Mike shared that, there's a lot of things at meetings that bother him, like the kind of overt leaning into prayers when it's not necessarily part of the book that we should say the Our Father, for instance, at every meeting. But he said, Mike said to me something that really impressed me, that when he first came in, he had a sponsor who just didn't care what he believed or didn't believe. He didn't try to evangelize or proselytize him in any way. It was just be here.
Old Bill.
Yeah.
He was a character.
And it really struck me as a lesson of, the power of just accepting people exactly who they are. And so Mike gives a lot of very interesting perspectives on being atheist. And I give a shout out in the book to a client of mine who read the first edition of Trauma and the 12 Steps. This is actually how he found me. And then went on to have one of his own stories published in Do Tell, Atheists and Agnostics in AA, share their experience, strength, and hope. And that book just impressed me so much, because even as somebody who does believe in a deity, it taught me that there's a lot of other stuff here too that I can lean into, especially when I have these moments where I'm in a real dark night of the soul with my own spiritual journey.
Yeah. All of us. Going back to, however, the idea of people not wanting drug addicts, for instance, at our meetings, all right, because of the element, this and that. All they need to do is go back in history. Go back in history to the beginning of AA. The majority of people that they were bringing in, they were literally dragging them off of the gutter. And these were people who had lost the ability to take care of basic hygiene. They were filthy. They were dirty. They were chemically induced by the alcohol to be sociopathic at a level that people didn't like them. People did not like them. And, Bill even was taking people into his house, and his wife would go crazy, but then she would take care of them. And they did not let that stop them from trying to carry the message. Yeah. In fact, Bill said, these are the people that we carry the message to.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, there's that's part of our history. That's part of our history. We I think we worry too much. What everybody likes people to be like them.
Yeah. Right? Our drug of choice is thinking we're better than other people.
That's it. That's exactly right. Well, I have a dear friend. She used to be a professor at the university, and she said her idea is that it is so wonderful that we have this prism of people, this tapestry with all the different colors and textures. Every person adds something a little bit different to that. And she'd say, I can close my eyes and visualize humanity as I've seen it and think, oh my God, how wonderful. Yeah. And, and hearing her talk about that, because she was passionate about that. And, that certainly helped me to do some work on some of my own little prejudices that we all grow up with.
Yeah. And I think it bears mentioning, first of all, Dr. Alcoholic Addict in the third edition, now called Acceptance is the Answer, bar none, my favorite story in the AA Big Book, both then and now. When I first came in.
You're not the only person.
Yeah. And it just so spoke to me. And, he talks about shooting up in his garage.
Yes.
In that book, like right in the AA
Yes.
book, and he calls it solid alcohol. So
Yeah.
sometimes when I lead at these meetings where there's crusty old timers, you're not a crusty old timer.
Yeah.
It's like,
Well, I do the same thing.
you know, it's like solid alcohol. And I'm very clear, I have to talk about the role drugs play in my story, because I was
True story.
I was in that position of being told, just don't do drugs. You can drink, but don't do drugs. You know, drinking was the more socially acceptable thing. And yeah, I ended up becoming a bigger alcoholic in the first place. But I'm so grateful to Janet that she was willing to talk about the interplay between the two. And had she not,
Absolutely.
It's another case of I would not have been here.
That is one of the most popular chapters in the book, that story.
It's poetry. It's brilliant.
In fact, that story was going to be taken out because they take so many out every new edition and add some new ones. And that one was actually scheduled. It was so popular that they said, we got to take this out of here.
Right.
Because people are starting to evangelize it. Well, it was such an uproar that they simply changed the name of it and moved it from one place in the book to another. But they did not get rid of it. Yeah. Because of the uproar.
Yeah, how truly fascinating.
Yes.
So, and the other thing I really think we have to talk about, because our world is going through a new awakening about the perils of racism and discrimination, that how much of this talk about we don't want a certain element here is because we have old prejudice or racism. I mean, it's not even old, just I don't want to discriminate against old people.
It's ongoing.
Just people who are racist and prejudiced and associate drug addiction as a problem of minorities.
Good.
And because I mean, whenever I hear that, you know, we don't want a certain element, it's like, what the actual is that code for?
It is a dog whistle. I really believe that. And it's generational. We make it generational in AA in some ways. And it needs to be stopped. It needs to be called out when it happens. It needs to be called out. We need to, you know, we need to have topics such as racism, and prejudice. Yeah, we did that
in our home group
a couple of weeks ago.
One of the best meetings I ever went to.
It was a fantastic meeting. It was, I mean, people got to share and kind of throw up some of the stuff that they had been harboring for years, right? Because our meeting is mostly white, although it is not completely white. All right, we have, but we have a couple people who make it a meeting. They're not token. Yeah, they're not token. They are an essential part of our meeting.
And I'm glad you talk about that, because I do take on tokenism in chapter 11 in one of the books, specifically in the context of treatment centers, because tokenism is this issue that we see in a lot of treatment centers. And here's how it can play out. Oh, but we have a gay member on our staff, so of course we're LGBT competent. And I've seen some of the worst treatment towards queer folks happen even when there is a gay person on the staff. Or, well, we have a Black counselor, but you're not listening to their perspective and their value and what they can bring. And so that is something that I address in the book. So I'm very glad you brought it up.
They have that. Their stories are not known. That's why it is so important to get not a rewriting of, but a reissue of old Black stories that are true, right? Because they've been lost. They didn't put them in the history books. They've wiped people, they've wiped a whole race out by simply saying we're all alike. And we're not all alike. Not at all.
So that's why I wanted these new chapters.
Yes.
And I'm glad that they're in there, because if we are going to solve what is this crisis of addiction, and it truly is. And I know we talk a lot now about the opioid epidemic for good reason, yet addiction's a tale as old as time, and it comes back and cycles through in new iterations. And I think also of Dr. Steve, my buddy who I referenced earlier, who says we're not in an opioid epidemic, we're in a trauma epidemic people take opiates for. We're in a trauma epidemic people use crack for. We're in a trauma epidemic that people drink for. And so let me ask you this, because this is something I take on in the book, because obviously I've worked in treatment centers where I've been told, you know, you're complicating matters looking at trauma. Like, people just need to realize that they have a disease, full stop. And I know there's a lot of this, if you work with trauma, you're just giving people more excuses. And a lot of people cite, you know, Carl Jung's letter to Bill W. saying like, hey, I tried with this guy Roland and I couldn't get a crack at him. But obviously, and I think a lot of 12 steppers can hold that in, like, see, we can do what psychiatry can't, or we can do what professional counseling can't. But again, that was the 30s. We've learned a lot since then. So, you know, what would you say to some of these folks from the old school, either professionals or folks in meetings who are saying that, you know, trauma, you're just giving people excuses?
If people are looking for excuses, they're going to find them anyway.
Good point.
So why not get it out there and inform our patients, our clients and our patients, that there is more available than there was when I got sober. I got sober 39 years ago. Nobody talked about trauma. Nobody talked about a whole lot of anything. It was, the programs were very simple. They were $81 a day.
Yeah, the treatment. Wow.
Yeah,
those were the days.
And there, you know, we have new, better approaches. You know, there is a state of art, right? They have repainted over some of these old canvases, and we have new approaches that work better than the old approaches.
Right.
And they give more people an opportunity to get themselves out of this loop that they are in of relapse, get better, detox, relapse, get better. You know, it can pull them out. This type of approach really gives people an opportunity to get well. You know, there's a part in the big book that talks about fear, and one of the things it says is that fear got me here, right? But if I don't deal with fear, it will take me back out.
Yeah.
So, you know, don't fall in love with fear because it got you here.
Right.
And understand that a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about fear is trauma-based. Those things, you know, especially these fears that are, you look at them in the context of what's actually going on, and you say, these are baseless.
Yeah.
Why are you afraid? This is never going to happen. But it's in here.
Yeah.
Somewhere. That trauma is so deeply embedded, even in a person's muscles, and we know that, that it's going to trigger people to do things that are way outside of what is in their best interest, and they don't even understand why.
Right.
Trauma-informed gives them an opportunity to figure out why. Right? You know, we used to tell people, get away from the why. Well, yeah, we have to do some of the why. Right? Of course, yes, we have to do the what, but
what
we also have to do some of the why.
Got it. So
I'm preaching.
So I'm glad soapbox is welcome when I invite you on a live cast. So I'm going to ask you a question, and then I want you to use that as an opportunity to piggyback to asking me any questions that may come up around this, which is where do you see the future needing to go? And that could be either in the rooms of 12-step recovery in a non-professional context, or it could just be with professional treatment. You know, either or, where do we go from here?
Well, the jury is certainly out on medically assisted treatment.
Okay.
But having said that, I'm going to say that because it's an approach that the people who pay for all of this, all right, can say, well, at least we're doing something with the money we're spending, that it is going to be medically assisted treatment is the thing of the future, at least for the time being. We're going to see more of it. They're going to start mandating it on the Medicaid level. And we have got to be prepared at some level or another
Right.
to accept these people into 12-step programs in a way that we haven't up until this point.
Right.
We, we have to stop this stuff that if you're taking medication, you're not really sober.
Yeah.
Forget it. That's
Yeah.
not true.
Mhm.
It's not really true. So, yes, some people abuse medically a treatment, of
Yeah.
course. But some people abuse,
Yeah.
let's face it, I sometimes abuse food.
Hello.
I sometimes abuse food. People abuse things. But there are a lot of people who, when applied correctly, these treatments are very helpful and give people an opportunity to do another level of treatment
Yes.
while they're on this, while they're being able to stay clean and sober.
Right.
And then wean them off of it. That's what I believe needs to happen.
Right. Right. And this is where a lot of my viewpoint has changed over the years, because I think we have to keep an open mind and an open heart. And the attitude I take in the book about medically assisted treatment, about psychedelics, about the whole harm reduction movement is, it wasn't for me.
No.
But it's kind of like, who am I to say what's going to work for someone else? And even though I have some opinions about it, for certain, they're really just that, opinions.
Yeah.
And it's the saying about opinions, everybody has one. And literature can often be used to argue things either way. And I whatever I feel about it, the key is it better not get in the way of me welcoming somebody to a meeting.
Correct. I can't agree more. And the other thing is that we have to realize there is so little actually known about what is medically assisted treatment and how does it actually work in the long run for real. Because the only one that we've ever had that has any longevity is the old methadone program. And methadone, I will say, and I'll say it out loud, methadone is a horrible treatment. It is not a good treatment. But some of the newer treatments, the Vivitrol and Suboxone and that can be used. They can be used appropriately without causing new problems.
Right. Right.
And it's time will tell.
So, any questions you have for me as we wrap up here?
What's next, Jamie?
What's next? Well, I'm going to swim and have dinner
after
we talk. I really think the future of health in our field and in 12-step programs has to be us as the providers doing our own trauma work and our own trauma healing. Because there's so much of this fear about trauma that I see in treatment centers. One of my best known blogs of last year was called "You Can't Shut Down Trauma," because I'm still hearing that coming out of treatment centers. Like, you got to shut down trauma when it comes up. And what they're really saying is either we don't have the time and resources to deal with it, or we don't have our own wherewithal to deal with it.
We haven't done our own work.
Right. And I very fondly remember the words of Dan Griffin, who's now a dear friend of mine. He also met me through the first edition of Trauma 12, and he wrote A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, and he endorsed this edition. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that we're traumatized, we're working with traumatized people as traumatized people. And then sending people into a traumatized recovery community, and the cycle continues and continues and continues. And I mean, my teaching on trauma is wound, comes from the Greek word meaning wound. And so much of what you need to know about trauma is just unpacking that word origin. And the key is, if we don't heal our wounds, we're going to bleed all over each other. I don't know an easier way I can put that. And hurt people is the axiom that often gets used to that. And we have to do our own work. It can't be that we go into the field just because we think we're going to stay sober working with others in a professional context. We can't go into the field as a way to meet our own superiority needs, that whole thinking we're better than people. And so much of my anthem, God, Daryl, in my professional teaching is, you got to do your own work. And even so many of these big complex questions people ask me about things like working with dissociation and working with complex trauma, sometimes I'll just throw my hands up and they say, there's no amount of money or technical training that I can give you that will replace doing your own work. And being able to respond from that very visceral, grounded place of having been on this journey before. And then you'll know how to solve these puzzles. You'll know that when you're in a treatment center, and yes, trauma may come up in a group, and the group is not the ultimate venue for dealing with it, you can still validate and still be sensitive and still teach the group a skill, while also sensitively letting the person know that this group may not be the best forum for you to unpack all of this. But I hear that this happened to you. I get that this is part of your journey. Can we maybe work on a skill to help you contain it for now? Containing's not avoiding. And then we can come up with a plan individually to figure out how we're best going to address this.
I think that it's the old timeout.
Yeah.
Timeout means timeout, but it never means stop.
Right.
It means timeout.
Timeout, pause, contain.
It implies we will get back to this, and it means that we have to get back to it.
Yes.
I agree.
And
I agree completely.
I cite in this book somebody who I respect a lot, Stephanie Covington, who wrote A Woman's Way Through the 12 Steps. And she was a real pioneer in that. And I remember I heard Stephanie speak at a conference here, I don't know, it was almost 10 years ago now. And she was speaking about the early 80s and how she was one of the first people in the addiction treatment field to even talk about trauma at conferences. And she did a talk at a conference on something like sex and violence and addiction treatment, and sex, violence, and trauma. And she gave the talk, and after the talk, she said people just tore into her saying, our clients aren't ready to deal with this. And she said what she heard in their voices is, we're not ready to deal with this. And because we're not ready to deal with this, we're not in a position to guide our clients with that. And that was the 80s, the early 80s. I think there's been a lot of progress in the right direction, but I still see a lot of that mentality.
Well, part of it possibly is that old tendency to make your job as easy as possible.
Yes.
It's like, the more I do this, the easier it gets, the more I can find shortcuts. And I did it in counseling. I'll admit there were times I did that in counseling. I shortcutted things, hopefully never to anyone's real detriment.
Right.
But, I wasn't the world's most ethical counselor when I got into this. I started counseling 9 years before I got sober.
Right.
And so I had a period of time in there where I was a sometimes drunk counselor.
You wouldn't be the first.
I know. Well, I
and
know
you won't be the last.
I didn't realize that as much as I do now. I didn't realize that at the time. But what really brought it home to me was I had a young guy one day who said, and they used to call me Doc. I'm not a doctor,
right?
But a lot of guys called me Doc, and he said, Doc, this might work better if you were sober too.
I love that.
And I went right into the social work answer. This is about you, not about me. But it hit. The arrow had already penetrated. And it was one of the pieces. There were many little pieces of things that led me finally to enter recovery, take a leave of absence from a counseling job to go into treatment.
Good for you.
Yes.
Good for you. Daryl, it's been a pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you for everything you've given me, every gift. And I could think of no better way to celebrate #Pub Day, as North Atlantic Books is calling it, appropriately enough. I'm like, Pub Day has a different meaning to me, or book release day. So again, the revised and expanded edition, the reboot of Trauma and the 12 Steps, a complete guide for recovery enhancement, is out today with North Atlantic Books. It's available online wherever books are sold. And please continue to stay tuned to this Facebook page. On Twitter, I'm at Jamie Marich. And we'll continue to post more updates, more interviews. I have a really good podcast I was interviewed for, Soberful, that's dropping tomorrow. And please feel free to stay connected. Thank you, Daryl.
Thank you.